Samhain, the Gaelic festival that marked the end of harvest season and winter's beginning, is the folk tradition that later inspired All Saints' Eve, or Halloween, after the arrival of Christendom in Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man. Samhain is believed to have originated in older Celtic pagan traditions, and evidence suggests that the time, about halfway between the fall equinox and winter solstice, has been considered important since ancient times. Samhain was seen as a liminal time, when the boundary between our world and the other world could be more easily crossed by the Aes Sidhe. The Aes Sidhe are supernatural beings that can be thought of as fairies or elves, or remnants of the pagan gods and nature spirits. The Aes Sidhe would need to be appeased with food or drink offerings outside of the home if the livestock were to survive the winter. People would also disguise themselves as Aes Sidhe, going door to door and reciting verses in exchange for food, the progenitor of modern-day trick-or-treating. The souls of the dead would also venture out of the other world at this time. Seeking hospitality, they would revisit their homes to find places set for them at their tables. Knowing this, perhaps we'll have a greater appreciation for these real accounts of supernatural phenomenon on Halloween night. Story 1. The Orb. I left work early on Halloween. My finances weren't good at the time, and my kids' homemade costumes still needed some assembly before they were ready to go trick-or-treating. The sun was getting low in the sky, and I can remember appreciating its sullen glow taking over my eyes. I was driving, though, and I cautiously reoriented myself, checking my mirrors. There was a dark spot on my rearview mirror, which at first I thought was a smudge. I licked my fingers and attempted to wipe it off, but it got larger. It was an actual object, and it was following behind the car. It didn't seem to have a form, and there were rays of darkness coming out of it, which of course didn't make sense, because a beam of darkness isn't something that I was taught was possible, and yet, that's what floated behind my car, swaying somewhat, modulating its pace. At one moment, it almost seemed to become aware that I had seen it, and it began whizzing around the car, floating easily past the driver's side window and in front of the windshield, blocking my view. I craned my head to look around the orb in a panic and tried to get home as quickly as I could. I made a left into my neighborhood, and it followed. It darted across people's lawns and between their trees as I drove down the suburban street. And at last, when I made a left into my driveway, the orb flew into one of our maple trees in the front yard and vanished. I sat perfectly still in the car for about 10 minutes, watching the tree, watching for the orb to appear. But it never did. Come spring, no new leaves budded on that tree. It's in fact been 6 years and the tree has never produced leaves since. Story 2. Catching up with the deceased. When I was a kid, my best friend lived one house over on the street behind me. We would talk all the time on walkie-talkie after our parents had thought we went to bed. On Halloween night, when I was 11 years old, we were both in bed and going over our candy hauls together via the walkie-talkie. He had just finished telling me about his disappointment in the number of Mars bars he had received when the connection burst into static, and I could hear a man's voice. This happened from time to time when there were construction crews in the area, although I did think it was a little unusual in this case because it was night, and the man was crying. I couldn't really make out what he was saying, except for one line. "I'm so proud of you, Nugget. You've grown so much. I love you, kiddo." Another burst of static erupted from the walkie-talkie, and then the connection returned to normal. It was also weird that my friend hadn't heard anything, since we were on the same frequency. The next day, I casually mentioned it to my mom, and she looked shocked, then burst into tears. My father, who died when I was 1, used to call me his little nugget. Story 3. The Wood Stove Face. Our house has a finished basement, which contains a wood fireplace. We used it once or twice around the time we first moved in, but since then my dad sealed it shut. It has 4 legs and a metal pipe that goes up to a chimney, but other than that, it's a completely enclosed black box with a tempered glass door. You can't really see into it though. The soot on the glass is so thick, it just looks like a haze. Sometimes animals would fall into it from the chimney, and they wouldn't be able to get out. My brother and I played in the basement often, and once every few months in the summer we would hear a few weeks of scratching, followed by silence, and then a faint smell. Because of the scratching, sometimes we'd pretend it was haunted, and would tell each other ghost stories about it to try to scare each other. On Halloween in 2002, we were doing just this. I was telling one of my favorite stories about a man who haunts the stove. We had the lights dimmed for a bonus effect. I was sitting with my back to the fireplace, and my brother was facing me. As I shared my story, I saw his expression change. He went pale, and his jaw dropped. He was, of course, looking behind me, and I knew better than to take the bait. I continued telling the story, but all of a sudden he bolted up and started backing away, even though I was sure he was messing with me. At this point, it would have been just irrational not to at least take a peek. I turned around to see what looked like the outline of a human face pressed against the tempered glass. I couldn't make out the details, but judging by the bone structure, it was definitely a grown male, and it was definitely on the inside of the glass. I stood up too and joined my brother in backing away. The face was contorting in a strange way where I couldn't tell what direction it was looking. My brother turned and ran up the stairs, and I soon followed. We ran right to our dad and told him what we saw. He had a confused look on his face, but followed us back down the stairs. Of course, the face was gone when he got there. He opened the fireplace and found a couple of squirrel skeletons, but nothing else. That was one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. Story 4. The Flower Map. When I was 13, we had a cat called Stocking. She was a rescue and she liked to be outside, and she usually came home. But on the Saturday before Halloween she didn't. 6 days went by and we didn't see or hear anything. We began putting up posters around the neighborhood. I remember doing a lot of sobbing at that time, and our older sister was doing her best to try to comfort us, telling us that Stocking would be okay. We didn't expect to have a lot of fun that Halloween. And on Halloween night, our older sister decided to bake me and my little sister some of our favorite cookies to try to cheer us up. We weren't even costumed. We were just sitting on the floor. Our sister had a bag of flour she was measuring from, and cleaning up minor spills with her hands. Her hands were slippery with flour, and when she picked up the almost full bag to put it away, she dropped it on the kitchen floor. We all gasped, but my older sister stayed with her hands covering her mouth longer than we did. She was looking almost in horror at the spill. I stood up to see what she was looking at, and my blood went cold. The flour had fallen into a shape that was unmistakably a map of our neighborhood. I traced the pattern over and over again with my eyes. It was clear that I was witnessing some paranormal event, but I didn't understand why deliberately this specific map, until I spotted an X somewhere in the middle of a major park a few blocks away. I suggested we go there and investigate. My little sister called me crazy, but my older sister agreed to go with me. She sketched out a copy of what the map was showing us, and we got in the car and drove there. I felt pretty terrified as we walked through the dark playground, not knowing what the map's intentions were for us, but it was comforting to know that my sister was there with me. We finally reached the spot that the X had shown us. It was a cluster of 3 large willow trees. We didn't know what we were supposed to be looking for until we heard a faint meow. It was stalking. She was stuck up the tree. We called the fire department, and she was rescued. I don't know what entity showed us that map, but I'll always be deeply grateful to it. Thanks for listening, guys. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell for new videos every Thursday, and also send me your nightmares to theforgottengrove@gmail.com for Sunday at 9 p.m. when I'll be live streaming Nightmare Theater. Until next time, embrace the beautiful dark.